Jordan and Zoe sat across from each other in a fancy restaurant, the soft glow of candlelight dancing between them. The warm, ambient lighting wrapped their table in an intimate bubble as they sipped wine, marking 6 years of marriage. To anyone passing by, they looked like the perfect couple, but the tension between them was almost suffocating. Zoe's gaze lingered on Jordan, her eyes scanning his face with a quiet but unsettling intensity. She swirled her wine glass slowly, the movement deliberate, before breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, almost too measured. "Jordan," she began, "do you love me?" Jordan blinked, caught off guard by her tone. He offered a small, reassuring smile. "Of course I do, Zoe. Why would you even ask that?" She didn't answer right away, just held his gaze with an almost unnerving steadiness. Finally, she leaned in slightly and said, "If you really love me, would you let me be with other men?" The smile on Jordan's face froze, then melted into an expression of pure disbelief. For a moment, he laughed softly, as though waiting for the punchline. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice tinged with unease. "I mean it," Zoe replied, her tone light and casual, as if she were talking about redecorating the living room. "Jordan, I feel like I need to explore, to figure out who I really am." Jordan sat back in his chair, his brows knitting together. "Figure out who you are," he echoed, his voice thick with disbelief. "What about us, Zoe? We've been happy for 6 years. Isn't that enough?" She let out a quiet sigh, tracing her fingertip along the rim of her glass. "Yes, we're happy. But don't you think people are meant to experience more? I feel like I'm missing something. Something I've never had the chance to feel." Jordan's jaw tightened as he studied her. "So, let me get this straight. You want to go exploring with other men, and that's supposed to help us?" "Zoe, this sounds like an excuse to sleep around. Be honest." Zoe leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, her expression unreadable. "It's not about that," she snapped, her tone sharp. "It's about understanding myself. How can I even think about having kids when I don't really know who I am?" Jordan softened slightly, his tone shifting to one of quiet frustration. "Zoe, maybe instead of chasing whatever this is, we should focus on starting a family. It's time, don't you think?" Her laugh was bitter, almost dismissive, as she waved away his suggestion like it was a trivial annoyance. "Children would be wonderful, Jordan. But how can I raise a family when I've never been with anyone else? I mean, I don't even know what I'm missing." Jordan leaned forward now, his expression hardening. "So, what you're saying is that you'd rather find yourself with other men than build a future with me?" A sly smile flickered across Zoe's lips as she took another sip of wine, her eyes gleaming with something between amusement and challenge. "Maybe," she said lightly, shrugging. Then, as if testing him, she added, "Tell me, Jordan, have you ever cheated on me? Had a fling on the side? Maybe?" Jordan blinked, his mind racing to catch up with her words. "Cheat on you?" he repeated, his voice low and tight with disbelief. "Zoe, I've never even thought about it," I said, my voice firm. "I've always been loyal to you. Have I ever given you a reason to doubt that?" She leaned in, a playful smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. Her finger traced lazy patterns on the tablecloth. "Oh, come on, Jordan. You know men are naturally wired for polygamy. It's biological, isn't it? I've read about it. Statistically, men cheat more often. So, what about you?" Jordan frowned, his expression steady despite the frustration simmering beneath. "Zoe, that's just a convenient excuse for bad behavior. Cheating isn't about biology. It's about choices rooted in integrity, honesty, and respect." She chuckled softly, resting her chin on one hand as her other hand continued to toy with the tablecloth. "All right, Mr. Integrity," she teased. "So how many women were there before me? Be honest." I felt heat rising in my cheeks but met her gaze head-on. "I've told you before. There was one girl I dated before you. It didn't work out. Then I met you. Now here we are, celebrating 6 years of marriage." Her eyebrow arched, the smirk on her face widening into a grin. "Come on, Jordan. You don't have to be so modest. It's fine if there were more. You can tell me. I am being honest, I said firmly, irritation starting to creep into my voice. She waved her hand like she was brushing my words away. You're too modest, she said, leaning back in her chair. I think you're just embarrassed to admit there were more. I opened my mouth to protest, but before I could speak, Zoe leaned forward again, her expression softening, though her words were sharper than ever. Jordan, she said, her voice almost coaxing, what if we tried this, just for a little while? An open marriage, something beyond us. Don't you think it might be good to explore? She studied my face carefully, then added, her tone growing quieter, I mean, you probably want to try something new too. Even if you won't admit it. Whatever warmth I'd felt at the start of the evening was long gone. It had been replaced by a sinking, icy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Zoe, I said slowly, struggling to keep my frustration in check, the fact that you're even suggesting this. It tells me something is already broken between us. Don't you see that? She raised her hand, her expression shifting to something almost pleading. No, it's not broken. At least not yet. Plenty of people say open marriages strengthen relationships. They say it gives couples the space to appreciate what they have. Don't you want that for us, Jordan? I closed my eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My hands tightened around the edge of the table. This is ridiculous, I said, my voice rising despite my effort to stay calm. How could you possibly believe this would help us? How could this make anything better? Her playful smile vanished, twisting into a scowl. Her eyes narrowed, irritation flashing in them like lightning in a storm. See, she snapped. You're not even trying to understand me. You never do. You pretend to care about my feelings. But the second I say something you don't like, you shut me down. I ran a hand through my hair, struggling to keep my voice even. Zoe, I am listening. But can't you see how absurd this is? A marriage, our marriage. It's built on trust and loyalty. Without those, what are we? She scoffed, her tone turning as cold as ice. And a real husband, a supportive husband, would stand by his wife. Even when it's hard. Even when he doesn't like what she's saying. Your ideas might be unconventional, but that doesn't mean I'm shutting you down. I shot back, trying to keep my frustration in check. She leaned back, her lips curling into a bitter smile. Of course you are, Jordan. You always do. The moment I bring up something outside your comfort zone, you act like it's absurd. Come on, Zoe, I said, exasperation boiling over. How can you possibly think any of this makes sense? This isn't normal. Her smile sharpened into something colder, more defiant. That's exactly the problem, Jordan. We're stuck in outdated stereotypes, bound by rules made up by people too scared to try anything new. Those limits, they're for weaklings. And I'm not weak. She leaned forward, her tone turning razor sharp. Even in the Middle Ages, Jordan, lords and dukes loved their families, but they still had mistresses. It was perfectly acceptable back then. I sighed, shaking my head. Zoe, that's not even remotely the same thing, and you know it. All I'm asking is for us to try, she said, her voice steady but brimming with determination. To give ourselves the chance to grow, to explore. If you really love me, Jordan, you'd let me have this. Don't be selfish. Her words hit like a thunderclap, and at that exact moment, a waiter passed by. He froze mid-step, his eyes going wide as his grip slipped. The tray in his hands crashed to the ground, plates and glasses scattering everywhere. His face turned crimson with embarrassment as he mumbled an apology and hurried away. I felt my own cheeks burning, humiliation spreading like wildfire as I noticed heads turning in our direction. The warm, cozy atmosphere of the restaurant had transformed into an awkward, stifling silence. Leaning in, I dropped my voice to a low murmur. Zoe, please, let's keep this between us. She didn't answer. Instead, she crossed her arms, her jaw tightening in stubborn defiance. Feeling my frustration reaching its limit, I grabbed the little brass bell on the table and rang for the check. Let's go home, I muttered. My tone clipped. Without waiting for her reply, I signaled to the waiter, who returned a moment later. His expression was carefully neutral as he handed me the bill, but I could see the awkwardness in his body language. The celebratory air of the evening had soured entirely. The drive home was oppressive. Zoe stared out the window, arms crossed, while I kept my eyes locked on the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The silence was deafening, each of us trapped in our own storm of thoughts. As soon as we stepped into the house, Zoe broke the quiet. Her voice sliced through the air like a knife. "I thought being honest with you was the right thing to do," she snapped, spinning to face me. "I didn't want to sneak around or lie. I wanted this out in the open." Her tone softened slightly, but the hurt in her words was unmistakable. "But clearly, Jordan, you don't care about my feelings. Not even a little." I dropped my keys on the table, the sound sharper than it needed to be. My movements were jerky as I turned to face her. "Not care?" I echoed, my voice thick with disbelief. "Zoe, this entire idea is insane. An open marriage? That's not honesty. It's not self-discovery. It's cheating. Plain and simple." Zoe let out a long, exasperated sigh, shaking her head slowly, as if she were explaining something to a child who just couldn't grasp a simple concept. "Maybe Mia was right," she muttered under her breath. Jordan's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "Mia?" he asked sharply. "She knows about this?" "Yes," Zoe replied defiantly, lifting her chin as if daring him to challenge her. "I talked to her and she said you'd react exactly like this. She warned me." Jordan let out a bitter laugh, the sound dripping with sarcasm. "Of course she did. Mia, the woman who's never even had a real relationship. If anyone's an authority on marriage, it's her, right?" Zoe's eyes narrowed, her voice turning cold. "Mia gets it. She understands that these old-fashioned ideas about marriage aren't for everyone. Open marriages are progressive, Jordan. They bring creativity and freedom. It's about living life without all these suffocating constraints." Jordan stared at her, the disbelief etched deep into his face. "So, let me get this straight. Mia's been filling your head with this nonsense." His tone was laced with disdain. "Has she convinced you that betraying your spouse is some kind of enlightened therapy?" Zoe bristled, her voice rising defensively. "Mia didn't put this idea in my head. This was my decision. She's just supportive. Unlike you." Jordan felt his patience snapping. "Supportive?" he shot back, his voice climbing. "Zoe, Mia can't even manage her own life half the time. She's bankrupt emotionally and financially. Do you really want to take life advice from her?" "Don't you dare insult my best friend," Zoe hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I've known her longer than I've known you. She's never judged me or made me feel small. She's always been there when things got tough." For a moment, Jordan softened, taking a deep breath to steady himself. His tone dropped, quieter now, almost pleading. "Does her opinion mean more to you than mine?" he asked, searching her face. "Zoe, I'm your husband. Doesn't that mean anything anymore?" Her expression hardened, her voice turning icy. "Don't manipulate me, Jordan. This isn't about choosing between you and Mia. That was it." The frustration finally boiled over, and before he could stop himself, Jordan slammed his fist down on the kitchen table. The sound echoed through the room, sharp and loud. "Zoe, enough!" he shouted, his voice trembling with anger. "Is this your big plan? To turn me into some kind of joke? A damn cuckold?" Zoe's eyes widened, her lips trembling as tears welled in her eyes. Her voice came out soft, almost a whisper, but it cut him like a knife. "You slammed your fist on the table, Jordan. What's next? Are you going to hit me?" He froze, recoiling as if he'd been struck. "What?" he breathed, his voice filled with shock. "Zoe, I would never—" "What the hell are you even saying? I'm furious, yes, but I've never laid a hand on you. And I never will." But Zoe had already turned away, her shoulders shaking as she began to sob. Without another word, she disappeared into the bedroom, leaving Jordan standing alone, frozen in the kitchen. A few moments later, he heard the sound of drawers opening and closing. A sharp pang of anxiety struck him, and he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Zoe? What are you doing?" She emerged from the bedroom with her purse slung over her shoulder, a small overnight bag in her hand. Zoe stood at the doorway, her small bag clutched tightly in her hand. Her eyes were red and puffy, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I can't stay here tonight, Jordan. I need space. Time to think." "You're leaving?" he asked, disbelief weighing heavy in his voice. "I'm not leaving you," she said softly, adjusting the strap of her bag. I need to be alone. I love you. But tonight, you scared me." "Zoe, where are you even going at this hour?" he asked, the anger from earlier now replaced by raw concern. "Don't worry about me," she replied, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I'll go to Mia's or maybe get a room somewhere. I just need some time." Jordan stood frozen as she turned and walked out. The sound of the door closing behind her seemed to echo through the quiet house, reverberating in his chest. He sank heavily into a chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table as his mind spun. A storm of emotions churned inside him: anger, regret, confusion. And then, like a sharp dagger, guilt pierced through it all. Had he overreacted? Had he lost his temper when she needed patience, when she needed him to listen? But another thought crept in, insidious and unsettling. Was Zoe really as shaken as she seemed? Or was this a performance? A tactic to turn the blame onto him? The questions clawed at his mind, relentless and unyielding, until a dull ache throbbed at his temples. The next day passed in a haze. Jordan moved through his routine on autopilot, barely aware of the world around him. The unresolved fight hung over him like a dark cloud, every word from the night before replaying on an endless loop in his head. By the time work ended, the thought of returning to an empty, silent house filled him with a sense of dread. Instead, he decided to take a long walk through the nearby park, hoping the fresh air might help clear his thoughts. As the sun began its slow descent, Jordan found an empty bench overlooking a serene pond. Ducks glided across the still water, their playful movements breaking the glassy surface. The late afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting golden patterns on the ground. He inhaled deeply, the crisp air filling his lungs and easing some of the tension in his chest. For the first time all day, he felt a faint semblance of calm. After sitting in quiet solitude for a while, his peace was gently interrupted by the sound of footsteps. An elderly man strolled down the path, pausing near the bench where Jordan sat. The man's face was kind, framed by a head of silver hair, and his eyes held a quiet, knowing wisdom. "Excuse me, young man," the stranger said, his voice warm and friendly. "Do you mind if I join you for a bit? I hope I'm not intruding, but I admire this view every day." Jordan, surprised by the request, found himself smiling faintly. There was something strangely comforting about the man's presence. "Not at all," he said, gesturing to the empty spot beside him. "Please have a seat." The old man nodded his thanks and settled down on the bench. His gaze turned toward the pond, his expression serene and thoughtful. For a while, they sat in silence, the soft sounds of the park, the rustling leaves, distant laughter of children, and the occasional quack of a duck, filling the space between them. The stark contrast between the old man's serenity and Jordan's inner chaos was almost maddening. How could someone look so calm, so at peace, while his own thoughts felt like a raging storm? After a long silence, Jordan finally gave in to his curiosity. "Sir," he said, his voice tight with hesitation, "how do you do it? How do you seem so calm, so happy? Don't you ever feel like everything's falling apart?" The man turned toward him with a faint smile, the lines on his face deepening with a quiet wisdom. His laugh was soft but resonant, like distant thunder. "Ah, young man," he began, his tone measured, "when I was your age, I thought the world rested on my shoulders. Every decision felt monumental. But as the years pass, you realize something. Most of what you worry about isn't worth the energy. Life is messy, always will be, but that's part of its beauty. You learn to see things for what they are, not what you fear they might be." Jordan stared at him, trying to grasp the weight of those words. His voice wavered as he responded. That's easier said than done. Feels like I'm drowning. Like everything I thought I understood is slipping away. Could you tell me how to stop feeling this way? The old man's smile faded, his expression turning serious. His gaze seemed to pierce straight through Jordan, peeling back every layer of doubt, fear, and insecurity. Listen carefully, he said, his tone low but firm. Don't fall in love with money. It will deceive you. Don't fall in love with women. They will deceive you. The words hit Jordan like a slap, sharp and unyielding. What do you mean by that? He asked, his voice strained. The man raised a hand, silencing him. Of all wines, the most intoxicating is freedom, he said, his voice now quieter, almost a whisper. Then he leaned in closer, his eyes locking with Jordan's. And remember this, only a fool is certain. A wise man doubts everything. For a moment, the air felt heavy, charged with an almost electric tension. Jordan couldn't speak, the weight of the man's words settling over him like a suffocating blanket. Then, as if nothing had happened, the old man leaned back and turned his gaze to the pond once more. The twinkle returned to his eyes, and a soft chuckle escaped his lips. Jordan swallowed hard, his throat dry. Thank you, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to go. The man nodded, his smile warm again. Take care, young man. As Jordan walked away, his heart pounded in his chest. The man's words reverberated in his mind, each one like a haunting echo. The part about women stung deeply, twisting into his thoughts. Was Zoe deceiving me? The idea took root like a poisonous vine, wrapping itself tighter and tighter around his mind. Could all of this, her tears, her words, her insistence on needing time, be a performance? A way to turn the blame onto me? By the time Jordan reached his car, his hands were trembling. A chill ran down his spine, but he shook it off and forced himself to drive home. The house was colder than he remembered, its emptiness like a living thing. Every creak and shadow seemed amplified in the silence. His gut churned with guilt, fear, and doubt as he reached for his phone and dialed Zoe's number. It rang several times before she picked up. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. Hello, Zoe, Jordan began, his voice low and careful. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I was out of line last night. I shouldn't have reacted the way I did. There was a long pause, the kind that made Jordan's heart pound louder in his chest. Finally, Zoe spoke, her voice trembling slightly. I appreciate you saying that, Jordan. I really do. I shouldn't have blindsided you with all of this. It wasn't fair to you. Her words soothed him for a moment, but then another wave of unease crashed over him. Zoe, he said slowly, his voice shaking, where are you right now? Another pause, this one shorter. I'm at Mia's, she said softly, just trying to think things through. Jordan clenched his jaw, the name sending a fresh spike of doubt through him. And Mia, what does she think about all this? Jordan, please, Zoe said, her tone sharp now. Can we not drag Mia into this again? This is our issue, not hers. That's what I thought, Jordan muttered, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Jordan, Zoe said after a moment, her voice breaking slightly. I don't want to fight anymore. I need time. Please. Jordan took a deep breath, gripping the phone tightly. I'll give you time, Zoe, but this can't go on forever. We need to figure this out. Together. Okay, she whispered. Good night, Jordan. Good night, he replied, the word feeling hollow as he hung up. The silence in the house felt heavier than ever. As Jordan sank onto the couch, the old man's words echoed in his mind, louder than before. Don't fall in love with women, they will deceive you. A flicker of hope and joy stirred in Jordan's chest as he listened. I understand, he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that had been missing for days. I know things have been hard, but maybe we can work through this together. Zoe sighed, her tone wistful. I want that too, Jordan, but I think I need to work through some things on my own first. I've been under more stress than I realized. That's why I've scheduled some sessions with a psychologist to help me figure things out." Jordan exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, their conversation had an air of honesty. "That's a good step," he said, his voice steady. "I've also decided to take some time off work," Zoe continued. "It's been building up for a while, and I think I just need some space to clear my head." "Good," Jordan replied, the tension in his shoulders beginning to ease. "Maybe a little space will do us both some good," Zoe agreed, mentioning her plan to stay with Mia for a few more days and then visit her parents at the farm. "I love you, Jordan," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "I want to save our marriage. I think a little time apart might help. Maybe it'll make us miss each other and come back stronger." Jordan felt a swell of optimism rising in him, fragile but genuine. "I love you too, Zoe," he said warmly. They said their goodbyes, and as Jordan hung up, a sense of lightness filled him. It was as if a great weight had been lifted off his chest. For the next 20 minutes, he allowed himself to bask in that fragile hope, daring to believe that things might finally turn a corner. But then, like a shadow creeping over his thoughts, the old man's words began to resurface, uninvited and insistent. Jordan walked to the kitchen, pulled out a notepad, and began jotting down the phrases that had struck him so deeply. "Don't fall in love with money, you'll be deceived. Don't fall in love with women, they'll deceive you. The most intoxicating wine is freedom." As he stared at the words, a chill ran down his spine. His pen moved again, scrawling the final phrase that had echoed in his mind all day. "A fool is certain of everything. The wise man doubts everything." The words seemed to leap off the page, deceptively simple but undeniably powerful. Jordan's gaze lingered on one phrase in particular. "Don't fall in love with women, they'll deceive you." It struck a nerve, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts like a splinter he couldn't remove. What if Zoe wasn't being entirely truthful? Her words from earlier replayed in his mind. The talk of needing space, of finding herself. Was it genuine, or had it been an elaborate excuse? Jordan's mind began spinning, imagining possibilities he couldn't ignore. She was staying with Mia now, unsupervised, free to come and go as she pleased. And then there was the trip to the farm. Would it really be about clearing her head, or was it a carefully constructed cover for something else? Had Zoe found a way to live a life without consequences? The seed of doubt planted by the old man's words began to grow, its roots twisting deeper into his thoughts. His eyes drifted back to the page, settling on another phrase. "A fool is certain of everything. The wise man doubts everything." It was like a veil had been lifted. Jordan realized, with a sinking clarity, that he couldn't take Zoe's reassurances at face value. Despite her soft words and promises of love, something felt deeply, inexplicably off. The old man's warnings were no longer just words. They were a mirror, reflecting the truth Jordan had been too afraid to face. The old man's words echoed in Jordan's mind, urging him to confront the situation for what it was, not what he wished it to be. His thoughts churned, restless and relentless, until an idea began to take shape. At first, it seemed extreme, but as it solidified, it felt like the only option. What if I hired a private investigator? If Zoe was truly using this time to work through her struggles, then the investigator's findings would bring him peace of mind. But if she was hiding something, well, he would finally know the truth. Jordan's heartbeat quickened as he stared at the notepad, the old man's words glaring back at him. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, Jordan wasted no time. He contacted a private investigator named Grayson, a sharp, seasoned professional in his late 50s. Grayson had a reputation for discretion and results, the kind of man who inspired confidence in delicate matters. Jordan explained everything. Zoe's sudden change in behavior, her talk of needing space, and the gnawing doubts that had been eating at him ever since. As Jordan spoke, Grayson listened carefully, his expression calm and composed. It was clear he'd heard variations of this story countless times before. "You're doing the right thing," Grayson said with quiet reassurance. I'll keep a close eye on her and provide you with regular updates. By the time she's ready to return, you'll have the answers you need." Relief and sorrow washed over Jordan in equal measure. This wasn't what he wanted, but it felt like the only path forward. A quiet voice inside him whispered that he'd done what was necessary. Whatever Grayson uncovered, good or bad, Jordan vowed he would be ready to face it. The next 3 weeks crawled by like an eternity. Jordan and Zoe spoke often, and to his surprise, their conversations felt light and positive. Zoe sounded like she was in a better headspace, telling him about her progress in therapy and how she'd started to see the flaws in her earlier ideas. She even apologized again for blindsiding him with the open marriage suggestion, admitting she hadn't fully understood the damage it might cause. The woman he'd fallen in love with, the warm, thoughtful Zoe he'd married 6 years ago, seemed to be returning. Hope flickered in Jordan's chest, fragile but growing with each call. Then, one evening, Zoe surprised him during their usual phone conversation. Her voice was warm, almost tender. "Jordan," she said softly, "I've missed you. I think it's time for me to come home. Let's put all of this behind us and start fresh. Don't you agree?" Jordan's heart swelled, a genuine smile breaking across his face for the first time in weeks. "Yes, Zoe. I'd love that. Come home. We can start over." They agreed on her return, and in the days leading up to it, Jordan threw himself into preparing for her arrival. On the evening Zoe was due back, Jordan filled the house with the scent of her favorite meal. The dining table glowed softly under the light of carefully arranged candles, and a bottle of their favorite red wine sat uncorked, ready to pour. Everything was perfect. When the doorbell finally rang, Jordan's heart leapt. He opened the door to find Zoe standing there, her smile warm, her face soft and familiar. She stepped into his arms without hesitation, and for a moment, all of his doubts melted away. She looked so genuine, so much like the woman he'd missed, that Jordan allowed himself to believe, for the first time, that everything might truly be okay. They sat down at the table, the candlelight reflecting the rekindled hope in their eyes. They laughed together, the sound filling the room with warmth. For the first time in weeks, the distance between them seemed to vanish. But as they talked, sharing stories and stolen glances, a weight lingered in the back of Jordan's mind. A shadow he couldn't quite shake. Grayson's investigation wasn't complete yet. Whatever Zoe said tonight, however sincere she seemed, there were still unanswered questions. And soon Jordan knew those answers would come. The evening carried on with a warmth Jordan hadn't felt in weeks. They laughed, shared stories, and reminisced, the glow of candlelight wrapping them in a false sense of calm and promise. As the plates emptied and their conversation began to lull, Jordan knew it was time to address the subject they'd carefully sidestepped all night. "Zoe," he began, his voice measured but soft, "I can see you're in a better place now. I can see the change in you, and I'm really glad." She nodded, a genuine smile lighting up her face as she reached for his hand across the table. "Yes, Jordan, I am. I've thought about so much, about us, about myself. It feels so good to be here, to have a fresh start." Her sincerity was so palpable that, for a fleeting moment, Jordan allowed himself to relax. Then, Zoe leaned in closer, her eyes sparkling with a playful glint. "Jordan," she said softly, her tone carrying a teasing warmth, "you were right about marriage needing children. I think it's time we start working on that." Tonight, Jordan chuckled, a wave of bittersweet warmth rising within him despite everything. "Well," he said, forcing a smile, "in honor of this evening, I actually have something for you. A gift, or perhaps two." Zoe's face lit up with excitement, her smile widening as she clapped her hands together. "You're amazing," she exclaimed, eagerly reaching for the box he handed her. But as she tore through the paper and lifted the lid, her excitement faded. Inside were 2 plain folders. Her brows furrowed, confusion taking hold as she looked up at him. "What's this?" she asked, a flicker of worry flashing in her eyes. Jordan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Go on, Zoe. Open them. Read." Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the first folder. The color drained from her face the moment she saw the bold letters stamped across the top. Divorce papers. She stared at him, her voice faltering. What is this? Keep reading, Jordan said evenly, his tone unshaken. Zoe hesitated, her fingers moving to the second folder. As she flipped through its contents, her face crumbled. Photo after photo spilled the truth she had tried to hide. The images showed her at nightclubs with Mia, her arms wrapped around strangers. Others captured intimate moments with another man at a hotel. The final blow came in the form of documents from a hospital visit, detailing a gynecological examination from just days before her return home. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Jordan, she began, her voice trembling. Jordan held her gaze, his expression calm but unyielding. You've been lying to me, Zoe, he said, his voice steady but laced with restrained fury. While I sat at home, believing you were trying to find yourself, you were out partying with Mia and sleeping with other men. Zoe's words caught in her throat, the weight of the evidence pressing down on her like a tidal wave. Jordan shook his head slowly, his jaw tight. You told me you spent the whole week at your parents' farm. He gestured at the damning photos spread across the table. But you were only there for 2 days. The rest of the week? This is what you were doing. Zoe's lips quivered, tears spilling down her cheeks as she shook her head vehemently. No, Jordan, no, she stammered, her voice frantic. This is all a misunderstanding. I can explain, I swear. Desperation rose in Zoe's voice as she clutched the folder to her chest. Someone's setting me up. These pictures, they're fake. None of this is real. You have to believe me, Jordan. Jordan let out a bitter laugh, cold and sharp. His eyes were like steel as he leaned forward, his tone calm but chillingly deliberate. You know, he began, his voice low. There's one thing I can't quite figure out, Zoe. He paused, letting the silence stretch, watching her squirm under his unrelenting gaze. Why didn't you enjoy all that freedom you fought so hard for? He tilted his head slightly, his tone dropping, each word cutting like ice. Or wait, I think I know. He leaned in closer, his voice soft but cruel. Maybe it's because those men you were with didn't want what I gave you. Commitment, stability. They didn't even want you. Just a few good nights and nothing more. Tears spilled down Zoe's cheeks, her sobs racking her body as she shook her head vehemently. Jordan, please, she cried, her voice cracking. None of this is true. You're my husband. You have to believe me. This isn't what it looks like. But Jordan stood, his movements slow and deliberate, as he gathered his keys from the table. His expression was unreadable, his voice carrying a finality that made her tremble. I've seen enough, Zoe, he said, his tone devoid of emotion. He gave her a small, cold smile, one that lacked even a trace of warmth. Enjoy your freedom. She stared at him, her face crumpling in despair. I'll see you in court, he added, his voice like a blade. Without another glance, Jordan turned and walked out the door. Zoe's desperate cries echoed after him, but he didn't stop. As he climbed into his car, a strange sense of relief washed over him. For the first time in months, the crushing weight of suspicion was gone, replaced by the clarity he had sought for so long. He drove to a quiet motel on the outskirts of town, where he finally allowed himself to breathe. The air felt cleaner, the suffocating fog of mistrust and deceit lifted. The divorce trial stretched out over the next month, each session stripping away the flimsy layers of Zoe's defense. She vehemently claimed that the photos and videos Jordan presented were fabrications, a cruel setup designed to humiliate her. But as Jordan's experts examined the evidence, the truth became undeniable. The photos were real, the videos were real, and Zoe's lies crumbled under their weight. By the end, even Zoe's defiance couldn't sway the court. The divorce was finalized, leaving her with little more than the hollow remnants of her once vibrant spirit. As she walked out of the courtroom, she looked broken, a shadow of the woman she once was. Mia, however, remained defiant. Ever the firebrand, she stayed by Zoe's side, her voice sharp with bitterness. Who cares about him, Zoe? She spat, her words echoing through the courthouse hallway. To hell with your paranoid ex. You deserve so much better. Her voice carried, catching Jordan's attention as he exited the building. He turned slightly, catching Mia's blazing glare. You weakling, she sneered, her fury palpable. Paranoid? Are you even ashamed of humiliating Zoe like this? You're just another smug, pathetic little man. For a moment, Jordan considered responding, but he quickly realized it wasn't worth the energy. Mia wasn't worth the energy. Instead, he met her furious glare with a calm, even expression and shrugged. I wish you happiness, he said simply. Good luck. Mia's sharp retort died in her throat as he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. For the first time in years, Jordan felt free from deceit, free from the lies that had poisoned his life. The future was uncertain, but it was his again. Without waiting for her reply, Jordan walked away, the cool autumn air filling his lungs. The crisp breeze felt invigorating, carrying away the weight of the past month. As he stepped out into the bustling street, a sense of closure began to settle over him. For the first time in what felt like forever, his steps felt light. In the weeks that followed, Jordan found himself returning to the park, the same one where he'd met the elderly man who had spoken such profound words. Each time, he searched the familiar spot near the pond, hoping to see that serene figure gazing out over the water. But the man was nowhere to be found. Curious and determined, Jordan began asking other park visitors if they had seen someone matching the old man's description. He described the silver-haired stranger in detail. The wise eyes, the warm smile, the air of calm that seemed to radiate from him. No one recognized him. Not a single person had seen anyone who fit the description, and Jordan's questions were often met with puzzled looks and shrugs. One sunny afternoon, Jordan sat on the same bench where they had spoken. He stared out at the pond, watching as ducks glided lazily across its surface, their ripples breaking the stillness of the water. The mystery of the old man lingered in his mind, gnawing gently at his thoughts. Had the man been real, or had he been something else entirely? A messenger, perhaps, sent to guide him at his lowest point? Or maybe he was a creation of Jordan's own subconscious, a manifestation of wisdom conjured when he needed it most. Whatever the answer, Jordan felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Peace. The doubts that had once consumed him were gone, their edges dulled by clarity and acceptance. His heart, once heavy with mistrust and turmoil, now felt calm. For the first time, Jordan could see life as it truly was, free from illusion, free from denial. With a quiet smile, he stood, taking one last look at the pond and the bench before walking away. A new chapter awaited him, one filled with clarity, freedom, and the promise of rebuilding. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. He was finally free to embrace life on his terms.